Thank you for that, Scotty. That was pretty good. I just want to thank Max and Simon again for putting all of this on. It's a pretty big deal to have something like this going on, and thanks for being silly enough to ask me to speak. I appreciate it. So my talk is called Sunlight, the Foundation of Health, and I think that pretty well frames the kind of thing that I'm going to go through today. I really do believe that the light that we get, the energy we get from the sun, is really the basis of life on Earth, and we've sort of forgotten about that. So yes, I'm a nutritionist, I'm a podcaster, I work as a pulmonary scientist in the system, and I'm a nature enthusiast. As far as disclosures go, I'm working with Kira Lee and Jalal Khan on the Quantum Health Academy that's going to start at the end of this year. So that's really the only thing that I've got going on as far as that's concerned. I just want to storyboard sort of what we're going to go through today, because I think it's important just to get an idea of the flow, because I want to try and tell a story essentially about how we got where we are today and the philosophy that led us there, and perhaps what we can do with the way that we think about these problems to make sure we can turn this around. So we're going to start out just by talking basically about what is light, because it's a pretty esoteric topic. It's not easy to pin down what light really is, so we'll try and get a handle on that. Then we're going to talk about health and light. So I just want to go over a few observations, a few epidemiological studies, just to give you an idea of the type of impact sunlight has on human health, just to set us up before we go deeper. Then I want to really get to the crux of what I really want to talk about, is how we got it so wrong. How have we ended up in a place today where we're using lights that are completely alien to us and that do not resemble sunlight at all? How have we got to the point that where we are today, where we've made so many mistakes after mistakes after mistakes? What's the philosophy that got us there? That's what I'm really concerned about. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about light-life interactions, so how biological systems are using light in order to function properly. Then we'll touch on circadian rhythm, and I guess those 2 points there, the light-life interactions and the circadian biology aspect, I really want to convince you that those are just two sides of the same coin. These are not separate things going on. They are exactly the same, and at the moment there's a bit of a chasm in the research between those two things, and really they need to be unified in order for us to really understand how to help people utilize sunlight for health. And then I'll talk about, potential solutions, hopefully, and some good things that are happening, because it can be a little bit depressing thinking about all this. So I want to start, before we get into the first thing, I want to talk about how humans have adored light for as long as we've been anatomically modern. Probably 300,000 years we've been worshipping the sun. Ancient Egypt, Stonehenge, tracking the cycles of the sun, tracking exactly the seasons to the precise day. Machu Picchu, again, one of these megalithic structures that perfectly tracks the equinoxes and the solstices, so that the people there knew exactly what was going to, from a food point of view, from a weather point of view, what was going to be going on. This is a site called Gigantia in Malta. I've had the pleasure of actually going there, and there's a few sites there, and it's very obvious when you go that these cultures were obsessed with the sun and tracking not only the sun but the stars, and clearly this was hyper important to them, because this would have taken generations. So imagine starting something that you're not going to see the end of. You're going to die before these structures are even finished. So clearly the drive to do this was so great, it had to be extremely important to them. And all cultures, all successful cultures have embedded in their practices the use of sunlight and the adoration or worship of sunlight. And in The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung, he writes this passage. I know it's not good to have large pieces of writing on slides, but bear with me. So he writes, every morning at dawn, he went to an East African tribe. He said every morning at dawn they leave their huts and breathe or spit into their hands, stretching them out to the first rays of sun as if they were offering either their breath or their spittle to the rising god, to what they call Mungu. When I asked them what they meant by this act and why they did it, they were completely baffled. They could only say, "We have always done it. It has always been done when the sun rises." They laughed at the obvious conclusion that the sun is God. The sun is not God when it is above the horizon, they say. God is the actual moment of the sunrise. So you can see these cultures had embedded into their practices sun worship. And we'll get into later how important that is from a circadian point of view. I was reading this going, these guys had the best circadian rhythms ever because it was culturally embedded into their practice. They didn't know why, from a scientific point of view, they were doing this, but they knew even deeper why they were doing this. Their knowledge was embodied. Ours is more intellectual, ours is more up here, but they were embodying their knowledge. And I think that's even more important. So they knew what we're only now rediscovering on an intellectual level. They knew at a deeper level and more fundamental way. So he was talking about the Sabini tribe in Uganda, and sunlight has essentially been the only source of light for as long as the Earth has been around. Fire is a relatively new invention from the perspective of 4.6 billion years. And the energy that sunlight provided is the foundation upon which life emerged and thrived on this planet. Without sunlight, you get nothing. And some of you might be thinking, what about, sulfur-reducing bacteria at the bottom of the ocean? They get no direct sunlight, but their whole metabolisms are based around the oxidative capacity of sunlight. So sun provides the charge separation events in water that allow them to use proton gradients at the bottom of the ocean. So if there's no sun, even organisms that never get exposed to sunlight directly, their whole life cycles break down completely. So every single life, every single organism on this planet is completely dependent on the sun, whether it's directly or indirectly. So we'll get into what is light. So light is electromagnetic energy. And it's pretty weird to think that we only interact with a very, very minuscule portion, a very narrow slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. We've all probably had X-rays before. We've all probably listened to the radio before. All of these wavelengths are still light. So it's weird to think that, when you're using your phone connected to the internet, those are photons that are using to communicate. It's just not photons we can see, so we don't really think about it like that. We only really think about light in this extremely narrow slice. You can see how small the visible portion is, wedged between ultraviolet and infrared radiation. And we seem to forget that the electromagnetic spectrum is so much broader than the part that we interact with. And I think this sort of sets us up when we try to intellectualize too much to think that what we're seeing is all that's going on. And I'm going to try and paint a picture of how that sort of led us down the wrong path. And light has unusual qualities. It has quantum properties. So the act of observation, the interaction with consciousness actually changes whether light is a wave or a particle. The conscious interaction with light sort of collapses it and makes it decide where it is and what it's doing. And this sort of goes back to the quantum thought experiments of Schrödinger. Anyone familiar with Schrödinger's cat? The cat, Schrödinger's cat was dead and alive at the same time, which sounds completely counterintuitive. So his cat was dead and alive at the same time. But has anyone heard of Schrödinger's dog? Who's a good boy and not a good boy at the same time? I was expecting a bigger response there, but that's okay. So when we're talking about light, we're really talking about sunlight. I think that's the thing most people think about when they say light. We're typically not thinking of compact fluorescent lights when someone brings up light. We're always talking about sunlight. So what are the characteristics of sunlight? So above our atmosphere, sunlight's obviously a lot stronger, and there's a lot more of the spectrum that's outside of our atmosphere. But our atmosphere's got lots of stuff in it, and that makes it that makes it sort of filter the light as it comes through. So you can see there's a few different spectrums here, but the red one is what I want you to look at. It's got all these gaps in the infrared, so you can see well beyond where the visible portion is. You've got all these gaps, and those gaps are where infrared light is being absorbed by water, carbon dioxide, and even to a lesser extent ozone. And ozone is cutting out the UVC, so the extremely high-powered photons it's cutting out, which is great for us because we probably wouldn't have been able to evolve very well with UVC. It's very, very high-powered photons. They tend to break things and make molecular complexity a little bit difficult. So we're sitting in this really good spot where we get UVB, which is really powerful and useful, but not so powerful that it breaks too much stuff. And you can see here photosynthesis happens in the blue and the red. Chlorophyll pigments don't really like green, which is why they reflect it out, which is why leaves tend to be green. It's because they don't use the green. Something about the energy of the green photons that they don't like. And you can see here overlaid on what we get, so this red portion that we see when we go outside, overlaid is we've got the big loop of the tungsten filament. So these are the old Edison bulbs. So when you run a current through a filament, you generate lots of long wavelength light, and you have to run quite a bit of current through it to get visible light, which is why the incandescent bulbs that we used to use take up a lot of energy, because in order to get visible light to make it useful as a light globe, you have to use a lot of energy. But the benefit of that is you get a lot of long wavelength light, just like you do in the sun. And over time, we thought, how can we make this more efficient from an energy perspective, which is quite a noble pursuit, really. And what we've done is we've come up with iterations, so compact fluorescence, halogen lights, and finally we've got to LEDs, which are a phenomenal technology. But as we've gone through and eliminated more and more energy, because we don't see the near-infrared and the infrared, so it's not useful for vision in that sense. And you can see the white LED. So you get a huge peak at about 420 to 450 nanometers, which you can see in sunlight, there's no such peak. You get a very broad, and because the sun is a thermal emission source, you get a very different sort of emission spectrum. But white LEDs are very, very peculiar. They're very alien. We've never before in our evolution would any biological system have been exposed to narrowband light. And you can see just how big the difference is between the old style lights and the new style lights and how they match up to the solar spectrum. So I think it's important to note that sunlight cannot be replicated. It just can't. You need a black body radiator to do what the sun does, and we just can't do that here. It would be too hot. So the sun's broadband thermal emission spectra and interaction with the Earth's atmosphere generate a unique energy source that supplies critical portions of the electromagnetic spectrum that facilitate the union of physics and chemistry. I think this is really important. Without solar radiation, the initial conditions for life on this planet just simply would not have been met. So sunlight was really the prerequisite for life. Without sunlight, you just don't get the life that we see today. So I want to talk briefly about health and light and sort of these connections. I'm going to try and not be too sciencey here, but there are a few papers that I think are really telling. The first one you probably heard of was set up by a Swedish gentleman, and they were looking at figuring out how sun exposure habits increased melanoma rates in Sweden, because that was the assumption. And this went over about 20 years, and they had, I think, just under 20,000 participants, so a huge study. And they expected to find that basically the people who had the sun exposure habits, the highest sun exposure habits, the people who were trying to get outside as much as possible would have the most melanoma. What they found was the exact opposite. So they say, we found that all-cause mortality, so not just melanoma, death of any cause was inversely related to sun exposure habits in a dose-dependent manner. So the more sunlight you got, the less likely you were to die of any cause. The mortality rate was increased twofold amongst avoiders of sun exposure when compared to those with the highest sun exposure habits. In this study, focusing on avoidance of sun exposure, the women with normal sun exposure habits were not significantly increased risk of malignant melanoma or malignant melanoma-related death. So they found the exact opposite of what they originally set out to look for. And these graphs are really quite telling. So the more sunlight you get, the longer you live. And there will be people out there who say, oh yeah, but the people in this study who got the most sun got the most cancer, which is true. Why did they get the most cancer? Because they lived longer. What's the number one risk factor for cancer is age. So, of course, if you're living longer, your risk of cancer is going to go up. But that's a real straw man argument here. And another thing they got from this study was the smokers in this study who had the highest sun-seeking behaviors had the same life expectancy as non-smokers who had the least sun exposure habits. So we can see that there's very, very powerful things going on here. Another study headed up by Professor Richard Weller, 376,000 patients. This is not a small study. This is a massive, massive study. Published, I think it was only last year or the year before. They found that greater behavioral and higher geographical related UV exposure. So basically, the more you sought sun and the closer you were to the equator, this was in the UK, and the closer you were to the equator, so the further south you were in the UK, was associated with the lower risk of all-cause cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality. So again, this is not just a singular effect. This is not just affecting one disease process. We're really looking at something that is at the foundation of human health. It's affecting everything. This study adds to the growing evidence that the benefits of UV exposure may outweigh the risks in low sunlight countries. And we'll get into some of the nuance about higher sunlight countries like Australia a bit later. This is another study by Sean Kane, who's an Australian, and they were looking at the UK statistics. So again, over 85,000 people. It's a massive, massive study. And there's 3 points here I wanted to get to. This was in their discussion. So circadian rhythm disturbance is a common feature of many psychiatric disorders. I think all psychiatric disorders. Light is the primary input to the circadian clock, with daytime light strengthening rhythms and nighttime light disturbing them. Greater nighttime light exposure was associated with increased risk for major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, psychosis, bipolar disorder, and self-harm behavior. Independent of nighttime light exposure, greater daytime light exposure was associated with reduced risk for major depressive disorder, PTSD, psychosis, and self-harm behavior. Avoiding light at night and seeking light during the day may be a simple and effective non-pharmacological means of broadly improving mental health. Again, we're looking at something that's not just affecting one disease process, it's affecting mental health across the board. And just seeking more light, getting outside during the day and dimming the lights or turning them off at night costs absolutely nothing. It would probably save you money from electricity. But these are extremely powerful things to do. So then we start to look at some of the studies. A few decades ago, there was an enormous amount of hype around vitamin D, because a lot of people were doing epidemiological studies. They take a big population and they look at the vitamin D levels in that population and they follow them. And the people with the highest vitamin D levels are protected from almost everything. So they come up with a hypothesis. They say, okay, what happens if we... So vitamin D has received widespread attention for its potential role in preventing cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. Pretty much every epidemiological study that they've done, you find the people with the highest vitamin D levels do better across the board. It doesn't matter really what disease you look at. So then you think, okay, what happens if we get a cohort of people, we divide them, and we have a control, and then we have a group of people who we give vitamin D supplements to get their levels up to where the people who do the best. Clearly, that's gonna prevent cardiovascular disease. That's going to prevent diabetes. So you get all these studies with interventional trials giving people vitamin D, saying, well, if high vitamin D is better, then we'll just give them vitamin D and it'll fix everything. And you look at these systematic reviews and they find absolutely nothing. It doesn't move the needle at all. So what we're looking at is vitamin D measured in the blood, the circulating form, is but a proxy marker for sun exposure habits. When you're looking at vitamin D in the blood, what you're seeing generally is how much time is this person spending outside? And it's not a vitamin D dependent story, because the vitamin D supplement trials all failed. They don't work. So it's something that the sun is giving us other than vitamin D, and it's probably giving us 1,000 things that we don't even know about. And that's why the messaging around vitamin D is confusing at times, because it really doesn't work to prevent cardiovascular disease, it doesn't work to prevent cancer, and it doesn't work to prevent metabolic disorders. Even though the people in the population who have the highest level are protected from them. That's because they're out in the sun. So vitamin D is but a small part of how sunlight regulates our bodies. Now, I want to show you some of my favorite statistics ever. So this is the association between UVB radiation, vitamin D status, and incidence of type 1 diabetes, so autoimmune diabetes. Now, this is the most perfect depiction of the effects of high energy photons on disease processes. So you can see where it's at the lowest, we're on the equator, so 0. The further away you get from the equator, either south or north, the more you get type 1 diabetes in the population. Now, to my knowledge, this hasn't been settled, but it looks to be not a vitamin D dependent process. So again, if you give people vitamin D supplements, it doesn't prevent them from getting type 1 diabetes. So again, there's something else about the sun that is providing protection from these types of conditions. This is multiple sclerosis risk plotted by latitude. Again, we see there's essentially no MS on the equator. It doesn't exist. It's actually quite remarkable. The associations that you get here, it's clear as day. And this is known for sure that this is not a vitamin D dependent process. The studies have been done. This has nothing to do with vitamin D. There is something else about UV light that is preventing the incidence of MS when you get closer to the equator. And unfortunately, vitamin D research has monopolized the research into the effects of sunlight. Everyone just thinks everything has to do with vitamin D. It's not. And unfortunately, so much has gone into vitamin D when, again, it's just such a narrow slice of what's actually happening. And we know that MS is not a vitamin D dependent incidence. It has to do with something else that's going on with UV light. And we don't know what that is. And unfortunately, we're probably not even looking in the right places, because vitamin D research takes all the funding money. Again, this is a very interesting association. Serum cholesterol levels, of course, when you have more UV light available, your cholesterol levels go down. And these are in populations, these are in just normal populations. So these aren't even sun-seeking populations. So really the ebbs and flows of blood lipids is actually probably much greater in people who are living an outdoor life. But this begs the question, could our mass migration indoors over the last century be a primary contributor to chronic disease? And I'm going to try and paint the picture that I think it is. So all life evolved with the expectation, I think that word is really important. Our biological system expects that sunlight and the energy therein is available to use every single day. Every single day. Whether it's cloudy, most of that light is coming through the clouds, but we can't see it. So our bodies have specifically evolved expecting that that's there, because why wouldn't it evolve to expect that light's going to be there? But when we move inside and we live inside all days, those expectations are not met. And when those expectations are not met, the body runs at a deficit. And that's just the way it is. There's really no way around that. How do we get it wrong? This is, I think, the main thing that I want to get across to you today is what led us from the point where we were worshipping the sun to the point where we're spending probably, I think across the population, people spend 90% of their time indoors. How have we got it so wrong? I want to tell a story about rickets because I think this is important to the topic of getting across how we philosophically got it wrong. So the first mention of rickets, 1634, it was a really, really hard time in certain parts of Europe. Rickets was also called the English disease because that's where they struggled with it most. And rickets is characterized by deformation of the bones, particularly the long bones. and it's lifelong. It's not something that can be reversed. Once those bones don't ossify correctly, they're stuck like that forever. So really, really debilitating disease. And for centuries, it was really unknown what was going on. They suspected there was a dietary element. They suspected there was an environmental element. We weren't really sure. But throughout Europe, there were quite a few doctors who realized that sunlight was important. Didn't know why, just knew that it seemed to work. Tuberculosis seemed to be able to be cured by exposure to sunlight. Rickets seemed to be able to be cured by sunlight. So a lot of these forward-thinking doctors in Europe decided to put their hospital beds outside. And they were getting really, really phenomenal results, which shouldn't surprise anyone. And Auguste Rollier is probably the main proponent of this. He set up all of these clinics in the Alps in Switzerland and got everyone, in their underwear. It was very cold. He thought that the cold had something to do with it as well. But the reason he had to go up in the Alps is because the further off sea level you get, the more UV light there is. He didn't know that at the time, but he didn't need to know. It worked, and patients got healed a lot. And we also had cod liver oil, which at the time was very cheap. And in Europe, there are periods of the year where there's no UVB light, so you can't synthesize vitamin D. And if you haven't stored up enough over the summer and you haven't laid down enough fat to store it, you probably do need to have some sort of intake of whether it's fatty fish or cod liver oil. So cod liver oil was touted as bottled sunshine because it did the same thing as sunshine did. As far as they were concerned, it cured rickets, which was a really big deal. And cod liver oil was very cheap, and they made it in the UK at the time when rickets was really quite a big problem. So it was really useful in Europe, where there were periods during winter where there was no UV light. And then we see this was 1931, US Department of Labor. This is an old pamphlet, Sunlight for Babies. And as I was saying before, rickets is very debilitating. If a child gets it, they're basically at a deficit for their whole life. It's really quite a strain on the economy. And they would hand out these pamphlets, and there's so many great paragraphs in this pamphlet, but I'll just read a few passages. So, the sun that tans the child's skin helps him grow normally. It gives his body the power to use food so as to build straight bones, strong muscles, and well-formed teeth. Every mother who wishes her baby to have robust health should give him regular sunbaths from early infancy until he is old enough to play in the sun himself. Dark-skinned babies need more sun to tan them and to protect them from rickets than fair-skinned babies. Everything written there is 100% true. They got it right. They didn't know why it was right. They just knew it was right. And this worked phenomenally well. Rickets got eradicated in the early part of the 20th century. So I want to ask, how did the messaging go from that to don't be caught in the sun, which the subtext there is don't ever be caught in the sun, and don't let the sun see your DNA. This is, standard messaging we see here in Australia. I think we have it the worst. And that's also a picture of a child that had tuberculosis that was cured by sunlight. You can see how pale he was before and how beautifully tan and how wonderful his skin looks after. And, your grandma knew this. Oh, you look pale. Are you unwell? Everyone knows that. When you have a tan, you're healthy. So how did we get, in the space of just several decades, how did we get this messaging? We're on the polar opposite end of the spectrum. And I think this quote really puts it all into perspective. So one of the most highly developed skills of contemporary Western civilization is dissection. The split up of problems into their smallest possible components. So good, we often forget to put the pieces back together again. And that's exactly what we've done. We've sought to find out precisely from an intellectual point of view what's going on. And by the time we get there, we don't even know what we're looking at anymore. You just have no idea how to contextualize that in the real world. So in the late 1800s and 1900s, doctors knew sunlight could cure rickets. It could cure tuberculosis. It was, and they had a phrase, malaise, which was generally used for things they didn't know what was going on. They knew it was curious. They had no idea why, but they didn't need to. It didn't matter. Sunlight cured it. They didn't need to know what was going on. They knew that cod liver oil worked, particularly during winter when the intensity of the sun wasn't as great. Didn't know why? Vitamin D hadn't been discovered at that point. They didn't know why it worked. They just knew that it worked. Who cares why it works? It works, and it was cheap. We knew what worked, but that wasn't enough. We've got big fat brains. We want to know why. And in the late 1910s, and this goes back to even before Niels Finsen using mercury arc lamps, which had a UV spectrum in it to treat tuberculosis, we see in Europe and America the use of special UV emitting lamps could be used to treat rickets. So we're sort of getting closer. We go, okay, sunlight works, but it's something we can, narrow it down a little bit further. It's a portion of the sunlight that's working. And we knew that because if you radiate one arm with UV light, the bones ossify in the other one. So we were going, okay, so it's not a direct effect. Something's going on where it's going into probably the circulation that's having abscopic effects. It's going all over the body. So we're getting even closer. We know something's happening in the skin. It's going into circulation. 1920s, we see Harry Steenbock radiating yeasts with UV light. And then what you could do is you make yeast extracts and put them in milk, and that would cure rickets. So we're getting even closer now to figuring out the precise thing. We're zooming right in. So we know that there's something is made, a molecule. When we extract it, we can put it into milk, it will cure rickets. Then in the 1930s, the pre-vitamin D is discovered, and then 2 years later, the vitamin D itself was discovered. And Window had already won the Nobel Prize 7 years prior to that for his work on sterols. So he was on the right path from the beginning. So finally, we've got from sunlight is curative to we know the molecule, which is great. And we come to today. And I work in a hospital, and I see this every single day, people just on 1,000 units of vitamin D a day. And I often ask people, how often are you out in the sun? And their knee-jerk response is, oh no, I'm on vitamin D, my doctor put me on vitamin D. So we can see just how zoomed in we've become that we don't even know what the problem is anymore. We don't even know what questions to ask. And the implicit assertion of this recommendation by doctors is that the only thing that the sun gives us is contained within a capsule of vitamin D. Whether they say that or not, that is the subtext of what they say when they prescribe. They say just take a vitamin D capsule once a day. That is what they're saying to you. That's the only thing that the sun gives you. You don't need to go outside. We've solved the problem. So, but as I showed before, the studies that look into the interventional trials where they give vitamin D, it doesn't work. So they should know that that's not all that's contained within sunlight, and that vitamin D is but a small aspect of the symphony of things that's going on with sun exposure. So today we have widespread recommendations of sun avoidance, and the vitamin D supplement market is an enormous market. And I think that's probably not a good thing, because people just think they can out-supplement actually getting outside. So we see this process of, we know sunlight and cod liver oil is curative, but we don't know why. So, we're doing all the right things there. Then we move along, we know a little bit more. We can use UV lamps and we can use yeast extracts to treat it. We're zooming a little bit in. And then we get to today. We know exactly how everything works. We know the enzymes in the kidney and the liver. We know exactly the kinetics of those. And the recommendation is just take a vitamin D supplement. So what's happened is the more knowledge we've gained, the further away from the truth we've got. We've zoomed in so far, we can't see the forest for the trees anymore. And I think this is exactly what's happened with our lighting environment. I think the exact same philosophical underpinnings have led to, we've got compact fluorescent tubes in here. Why have we got to the point where this is sort of the first choice for indoor lighting? The more we have zoomed in and isolated the problem, the more we have systematically generated solutions that are limited in their utility and sometimes even anti-useful, which is where I think we're at today. They're anti-useful. They're actually detrimental. So I really like this picture because it highlights how how things have changed. So for 4.6 billion years, for the whole time the Earth has existed, what we've had is just solar radiation. That's it. But 100 years ago, that changed for the first time. And we started to get lights that have emission spectra that do not match the way that our bodies have evolved. They've evolved to perfectly use solar radiation. And you can see the more into it we've got, the more adulterated the spectrum has become. And our bodies only know how to effectively use sunlight. These other spectrums of fluorescence and LEDs, and even to a lesser extent incandescence, but incandescent lighting is probably the most favorable thing we have. But of course, just like raw milk is illegal, incandescent bulbs are illegal. So again, this is sort of where our philosophy has led us to a point where the only really safe lighting option is illegal. It's a hard thing to sort of wrap your head around. And again, LEDs are a phenomenal technology, but we've zoomed in so far, we just don't understand. We just don't understand what we're doing. And the problem is not only the spectrum, but sunlight is so much more powerful. Everyone knows this when they're inside all day and they go outside and they have to squint, even though it seems like it's the same, it seems very bright inside. When you go outdoors, you realize how weak indoor lighting really is. And what's really important to understand is that we don't see most of light. We just don't see it. So it's very difficult to know when it's there and when it's not. The main way to know is whether we get warm or not, and that's why old incandescent bulbs used to get hot, and that was because they're emitting long wavelength light that heats things up. But modern lighting has zero near infrared, and we don't know because we can't see it. So it's a really nefarious problem because it's like Wi-Fi. You can't see it. It's very, very intangible. What we've experienced with our lighting environment is a qualitative change, not a quantitative change. This is not, the intensity's been lowered a little bit. There's a little bit less near infrared. No, it's completely different. It's a qualitative change. Our bodies have absolutely no idea how to use modern lighting fixtures. But because of the way our vision has evolved, we never needed to see any of that because we were always just outside. The sunlight was our only option. We haven't even noticed. No one knows, and I think this is why it's such a nefarious problem, is because most people are aware that processed foods are bad for you. No one going to McDonald's is thinking that this is a good option. They're there despite the fact that they know it's not a good option. But no one knows their LED fixtures in their homes and their offices are detrimental to their health. So that's why I think it's so much worse a problem than the food problem, because people do not even know that it's a problem to begin with. So let's talk about light-life interactions. So I just want to preface this by talking about how varied human beings are. So on the left, we see the Sami people of Scandinavia. You can see how little pigment they have in their skin. And then we look at the Hadzabe of East Africa. It's basically where Homo sapiens started in the East African Rift. And you can see the pigmentation differences are enormous. So in order to talk about light-life interactions, we have to establish that there is an extraordinary variation in the way that our bodies are able to accept and use light. It's a very, very big difference, and blanket statements don't work. They simply do not work. And I'll read the first study I showed you several slides ago. Had a comment by Nina Jablonski, who's an anthropologist, and she looks at skin color and the biological and social importance of skin color. And she writes, from an evolutionary perspective, there must be a selection advantage in being less pigmented when living far from the equator. Otherwise, differences in skin pigmentation would not have emerged. Fair skin might confer an evolutionary advantage in regions with low solar intensity by preventing vitamin D deficiency and thereby increasing longevity and reducing infections. However, a fair-skinned individual, for example, emigrating from the UK, would not derive any additional benefit from the light skin in Australia, where pigmented skin is an advantage due to high solar intensity. So we can see that there's nuance here with sun exposure guidelines, which is unfortunate because everyone gets the same message here, which is never go out in the sun, which is an absolute disaster for people coming from who have heritage closer to the equator with more pigment in their skin. And this is one of the big reasons why ethnic minorities tend to do worse with health, because they need more sunlight than we do. And the fact that skin depigmentation has evolved at least three times, it's suspected that it's much more, is irrefutable evidence that our skin requires a certain amount of UV photons. Otherwise, our skin wouldn't have depigmented. We'd all be completely covered in melanin if UV was bad. The fact that we depigmented is, like, you can't get better evidence that we need some, absolutely. And the further north we went, the more depigmented we became. And the reason that is because if you can't make vitamin D, your bones don't develop properly. And if a woman's hips don't develop properly, they cannot birth. And these are, on the right, that's a skeleton from someone who obviously had rickets. And you just cannot give birth. So depigmentation would have been highly, highly selected for. And you can see here, this is a native Australian. Now, they are perfectly adapted to the environment here. I'm much more pale, so obviously the amount of time I'm going to be able to spend outside in direct sunlight is significantly less than them. They are perfectly designed to spend all day, every day outside, starkers in full spectrum sunlight. Me, in summer, I can't handle that. And it's just about being smart about the recommendations that we give. So pigmentation type is also somewhat fluid. So I can tan quite well. Some people can tan really, really well, others not so much. And we just need to understand that we're living in a place that is not our ancestral home. So we need to be careful because UV lights, these high energy photons, can be dangerous. The important word there is can. They're not dangerous a priori, they can be in certain situations. So this is a very interesting take on UV light from a dermatologist, believe it or not. He's a brilliant guy. UV radiation as an initiator and driver for biological evolution, he starts. UV radiation is enough to drive chemical reactions independently on metabolism and to damage the cell. DNA effectively dissipates energy of excitation and can store genetic information, including only a limited number of UV-induced mutations. The cell also gets information on UV to set off the processes for repair and photoprotection, thus maintaining homeostasis, preserving enthalpy, and facilitating evolution. So basically what he's saying there is UV light played an indispensable role in creating chemical complexity. And also that UV light itself is the initiator for repair. So yes, it can be damaging, but it's also the initiator for repair. And where UV light hits on the skin, I mean, everyone knows our skin sloughs off every 20 days. The reason it does that is because the region that's exposed to UV light, our body knows, yeah, that needs to be restored every 20 or so days because that's where the high energy photons are hitting. So this is a bit of a tangent, but I want to talk about iguanas. So in America, a lot of households have iguanas. And when you go to buy a pet iguana, you have to buy special lights to put in their enclosure. You have to. They need UV light. For the same reason we do, the underlying physiology is exactly the same. You need to give them broad spectrum infrared light and you need to give them UV light. Otherwise, they get breaks in their long bones. Our physiology is exactly the same, but we don't do this in our preschools. We don't do this in our nursing homes. We don't do this in our schools. We don't do this in our workplaces, but we do it for our iguanas. What is going on here? This is cognitive dissonance at its greatest. Why are we know, oh yeah, you can't have a pet lizard. It needs full spectrum light, otherwise it will die. Our underlying physiology is identical. Why aren't we doing this to protect our population? Why are we only doing it to protect our reptiles? A quick word on skin cancer. I didn't initially have this in my talk, but I think it's probably important because it's always the first thing everyone asks. So I want to talk about some paradoxes that exist in the current messaging surrounding melanoma. First of all, there's three main types of skin cancer. Melanoma is the big one. That's the one that's fast metastasizing, very, very dangerous. The other two, squamous cell carcinoma, basal cell carcinoma, we don't even count them in our cancer statistics. They're very slow metastasizing. They get burnt or cut off, or you just leave them. They don't kill people, generally speaking. They're cosmetic. So we don't even count them in our cancer statistics. They are not in there. So melanoma is really the only one that everyone really cares about, but the big C word is there. So one of the paradoxes, melanoma patients have the lowest vitamin D levels, and those with the lowest vitamin D levels have the most unfavorable prognosis. If melanoma was caused by sun exposure, the patients who are diagnosed with melanoma would have the highest vitamin D levels, no? This doesn't make sense, and there's quite a few publications showing this. Melanoma rates are only increasing in indoor workers. Outdoor workers are protected from melanoma, even though they get 3 to 10 times more annual UV exposure. So that's another paradox. Epidemiological studies fail to report consistent associations with sun exposure and melanoma, with some finding inverse associations. Chronic or habitual sun exposure appears to have little effect on melanoma incidence and may even have a protective effect. So a lot of these epidemiological studies are showing that people who spend the most time outdoors are actually protected from melanoma. And the people who spend the least amount of doors and particularly have intermittent exposures, so people who are sitting in their office for 6 months of the year, they fly down to, Bali or whatever, they go out in the sun all week and then they go back. Those intermittent exposures are what are associated with melanoma. Chronic exposure is protective. So if you're outside all the time, you're protected. Melanoma risk appears to increase alongside decreasing personal UV exposure. So the less UV you get, the more melanoma risk you have. And this is coupled with the vitamin D story as well. So the higher your vitamin D levels, the less likely you are to have melanoma. And many melanoma are found on the least sun-exposed areas of the body. If anyone's ever got a skin check, they check between your toes, and you're thinking, why the hell are you checking there? And the reason is because these melanomas are not caused by direct exposure to sunlight. The squamous cell and basal cell carcinomas tend to show up on the most sun-exposed parts of the body, on the hands and on the face, but not melanoma. It's a very, very complex, very different story. And the idea that sun exposure causes melanoma is, in my opinion, completely unsupportable with the available evidence. And the last one, and this is my point, I don't have any references here, but we've never spent less time outdoors evolutionarily. No one has, populations have never spent less time indoors, yet we have the highest and growing rates of melanoma ever. How do you square those two things together? To me, it doesn't make any sense. And if anything, it suggests that our detachment from sunlight is what's causing melanoma and these problems with the pigmentary system. So that was sort of the UV portion. I want to talk about the other side of the spectrum that we don't see. And to start, there's a lot of nomenclature that gets thrown around, near infrared and infrared. What's the difference? Can I use them interchangeably? From my understanding, and this is the way that I characterize, near infrared is a thin part of the portion of infrared that is not strongly interacting with water molecules. So they are able to bounce around and scatter. Whereas infrared interacts very strongly with water molecules, which is why when you go outside and you put your hands over the fire, the infrared light is interacting with the water molecules and it's heating you up. Near infrared does not do that. Near infrared is not strongly absorbed by water. It's not strongly absorbed by very much at all in the body. And what that allows it to do is scatter. So it hits the body and it bounces through like a pinball machine. And this is a great sort of look into it. So the folding of the brain is actually a light guide. And near infrared goes straight through the skull. Even if you've got hair, it goes straight through and it's being scattered around. And you can see it shows up in the middle of the brain. Near infrared is going all the way through the body. Not directly, it's bouncing around, probably millions, billions of times. But it's getting very, very deep, not directly, but it's bouncing around. And a good way to think about this is the analogy of IKEA. Everyone's been to IKEA. They make you walk all the way around everywhere, and you have to see everything before you can go out. That's what a near-infrared photon is doing. It's going in, and it's bouncing around, going around everything, because it's a weak absorber of most things in the body. So it hits something, weakly absorbed, bounces off, keeps going. And what that does is it increases the opportunity for that photon to hit something that it does interact with, which is present in the mitochondria. So that's the difference between infrared and near-infrared broadly. Infrared has that heating element. Near-infrared does very specific things in the body because it doesn't interact with water molecules, and of course we're mostly water. So I'm going to show you a series of images by my friend Bob Fosbury. These are near-infrared photographs. And what you'll notice is when you're outside, plants and natural surfaces reflect near-infrared almost at 100% efficiency. We cannot make anything that does anything remotely, anything like that. And the whiter the image, the more near-infrared, the darker, the less near-infrared. And you can see here, obviously you're standing up straight taking that photo. All of this near-infrared light is being reflected at you horizontally. So even if you're standing in shade, you are being imbued with all of this long wavelength light, and you can't see it. You don't know it's there. It's not infrared, so it doesn't have a thermal effect. You know when you're standing in shade because it's colder, but all that near-infrared light is being reflected straight back at you. And it's filling up the body because as it scatters, those photons stay in your body longer than it takes for another one to get in. So it's like inflating a balloon. When you're outside, you're getting gradually increasing the photon density within your body. And again, you don't have to be in direct sunlight to get this benefit. You just have to be outside. Windows get rid of this near-infrared. You can't be indoors. And that's one of the key things, like I was saying before. I can't be outside all day on the summer solstice. I will burn to a crisp. But once I've got enough UV, I can just go in the shade and I get the benefits of all of the other parts of the sunlight. And when you're in the shade, you get a change in the ratio as well. So you get less visible light and you get more near-infrared. It's very healing to sit in the shade or go for a walk under forest cover because the ratio of visible to near-infrared goes down. You get much more near-infrared. It's very healing for the body. And you can see all of these different natural places. Even though you can't see it, you can't necessarily feel it. You're getting absolutely hammered by near-infrared photons. They are everywhere outside. And the beauty of photosynthesis is plants don't like near-infrared light. And what they've done, I'm anthropomorphizing here, but they've donated that light to us. They've said, we don't want it. It's not useful for us. You have it. And of course, plants evolved before us. So we've gone, hey, there's heaps of near-infrared out here. Let's use it. And we have. But indoors right now, there's none. And this is a photo of Bob Fosbury's hand. So you can see the near-infrared basically goes straight through. Again, it's not direct. And the only strong absorber is the hemoglobin in the veins. And this is his olive tree. He puts this olive tree outside of his window. So he opens up his window in his office. And he's getting hammered with near-infrared photons. Even though he's inside, he just has to open the window and this olive tree is donating all of this near-infrared to him, which is great. So the next slide is a picture of a near-infrared photo inside an office building. I haven't forgot to put the slide in. It is near-infrared dark. There is no near-infrared at all. It's not like there's a little bit, there's zero. This again, it's not a change in magnitude, it's a change in kind that we're experiencing. Again, this is his hand, and if you look at the optics literature, they say near-infrared light only penetrates about 1 millimeter. And you see this in some of the photobiomodulation papers, and you go, all right, every 5-year-old with a flashlight who puts it under their chin knows that red light goes much further than that. And that's because they don't understand scatter characteristics. This light is penetrating about 1 millimeter, but then it's scattering all the way through. So, our liver, our guts, our kidneys, when we're outside, are all getting near-infrared light. Not directly, but it's bouncing around, it's getting down to there. And you might be thinking, do I need to be naked? No, you do not. Near-infrared light is clothes are basically transparent to near-infrared light. So me even going outside with all this on, the vast majority of that near-infrared light is going straight through my clothing. So you may think, oh, there's no point going outside because it's too cold to take my clothes off. Get outside. Even if you're covered up from head to toe, all those near-infrared photons are still reaching your body. So just a brief look, I don't want to get too sciencey, but basically long wavelength light, this near-infrared and infrared portion of the spectrum has very, very powerful effects on bioenergetics, how we make energy. So when we're exposed to long wavelength light, the kind of light that is completely absent in this room, ATP production goes up, reactive oxygen species go up because they always go up together, nitric oxide goes up, very important signaling molecule, metabolic water goes up because you're producing more ATP, so you're generating more water, you're hydrating yourself better from the inside. Cell membrane potential goes up, which is very important because one of the primary signs of cancerous cells is their membrane potential drops. That's maybe the initiating factor. Magnetic field strength goes up because you've got more spin of that ATPase. Glucose goes down because you're using sugar. CO2 goes up because you're burning sugar. Biophoton release goes up because you're generating lots of reactive oxygen species. And your NADH to NAD ratio goes down because, again, you're using that NADH to drive a proton gradient. So many things are happening. This is really, really pivotal. And when we're standing inside right now, none of this is going on. We're not getting, and remember, this is the expected state. This is our body's expected state. It wants to be like that all day. And Newton was harvesting photons that were making his mitochondria function optimally. That's how he figured out gravity when he was sitting under that tree. Didn't have to be in direct sunlight. He was getting all of that near-infrared photons reflected off that landscape right at him. So I want to briefly talk about circadian rhythm. I think this frames it really well. Nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. Circadian rhythm is just like that. We just want to follow what it's guiding us to do. I'm going to read a passage because it's very difficult for me to freestyle this. I'm going to read a short passage about what I think the importance of circadian rhythms are. So, evolutionarily, light has been the anchor of biology. It is the primary environmental input that determines periods of activity and rest, and is ultimately a primary vector for the limits of biology. Sunlight provides vital energy to all life on Earth. When it is absent, organisms must change their activities accordingly or risk potentially lethal limitations in energy metabolism. This stimulus of constant and reliable light-dark cycles, constant and reliable, drove the evolution of circadian rhythms. These rhythms are the roughly 24-hour cycles of activity and rest that are essentially exhibited by all organisms. These cycles govern countless physiological functions, including alertness, strength, hormonal secretions, appetite, gastrointestinal motility, uresis, thermoregulation, and even nasal dilation. The Earth's light-dark cycles have been so reliable and unchanging that evolution cemented it as the foundation upon which biology functions. The sun has always risen and set every day since the Earth has formed. So really, the point I'm trying to get across is biology really put this at the foundation. These light-dark cycles, can't get around them, they're there every day, so we need to orchestrate everything around them. And we've not done that because we can see nighttime illumination. And the more illuminated a place is, the higher the risk of cardiovascular disease. And there's a lot of people saying, oh, well, it's other factors. But when you understand the impact of light on human health, you see why this could be very well true. And we can track the light pollution across the last, half century. And the worse it gets, the worse the health outcomes get. And this is another study that also found increased risk of cardiovascular disease depending on the light density, artificial light density in the person's locale. So I think this really sets it quite well. Yes, circadian rhythms actually do affect almost everything. And I'll quote Rob yesterday. He said, when the clock's broken, anything can happen. And I think that's about as good as you can get. Rhythms allow the cell to anticipate regular changes so that the appropriate cellular activities happen at appropriate times of the day. Cells whose internal rhythms are out of sync with their environment do not grow as well as cells whose clocks are in tune. So I won't go too much on about there. So where to now? I really want to sort of unite these light-life interaction researchers in with the circadian researchers, because we've got this huge chasm between the two. And the reality is we need to realize that they're just two sides of the same coin. They are the same thing. And until we unite them, we won't be able to have, really, really helpful advice about what to do. And I think we need to shift our vocabulary. I think this is really important to say that, being outdoors in sunlight is not good for you. It's just normal. That's the normal expected state of affairs. It's not making your health better. It's just bringing you back to baseline. And I don't want people to start thinking, oh, I'm using my red light panel, it's good for me. No, it's not good for you. It's just you're deficient in light and it's helping you get back up to baseline. Being in an outdoor natural environment is the body's expected baseline physiological state. I think that's the main thing I want to get across. We're meant to live outside all day, all right? Not necessarily outside cooking with our clothes off, just outside. You just have to be outside. I want people to realize that these red lights, they're not good for you. They're just slightly better than the alternative. Remember, these lights have no near infrared, so they're still just as alien as the blue LEDs. They're not good for you. They're just a little bit better than the alternative. I want people to realize that blue blockers aren't good. They're just slightly better than the alternative. It's not the goal. We don't want to, again, we're narrowing down, 450 nanometers is what interacts with melanopsin. Therefore, if I block that, I'm good. Again, we're so zoomed in. What's the problem here? Like we don't even know what it is that the problem that we're looking at. Blue blockers they're useful, but they're not a solution. They're just slightly better than the alternative. And we've got amazing companies like the Daylight Computer. We've actually got people out there who are looking out for their customers and trying to make technology safe, which I think is something we can all get behind, because we're not going to let go of technology. We need to actually learn how to use it safely and effectively. And this project makes me very optimistic about the future, because there are people out there going, we can do this properly. We're smart enough to actually do it correctly. And a friend of mine, Scott Zimmerman, he's actually found a way to get around the Department of Education, Department of Energy, and make incandescent bulbs that meet their standards. It took him a very long time to do that. And these bulbs have broadband near infrared. And before anyone asks me, they're not available in Australia yet. I'm working on it. But this is a massive step in the right direction. So this is where humans are supposed to be. This is where we're supposed to thrive, outdoors. That's the main message. Thank you.